Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of Bias Summit. We're going to kick off with Jon Scott's annual State of Play of the Union sector update, which apparently he was updating yesterday in light of breaking news. So, Jon, thank you.
Morning, folks. Welcome to this. I've been asked to try to be gentle with you and give you some good news as well. I'll do my best. So let's just have a quick reflection. I'm not going to talk about all these topics, but just some of the things that have. Well, they're not advancing. Let's go to that. Okay, so what's been going on? What have you recalled? What have you consigned to your closed boxes of I can't go there again in my subconscious? Exactly, yeah. So we've had lots of education secretaries. At the moment, as of this morning, we have Kit Malthouse. You've probably never heard of him, but he's in charge of DFE. At the moment, we don't know who's got education. All we do know is it's not Michelle Donovan because she's got culture. So what have you been up to? You've got back to face-to-face teaching or not. So there's been a mix. Some institutions are remaining with hybrid. And I just put that up there, the GIST survey that's just come out, which showed a slight majority of students actually wanted to remain with blended rather than to revert to full face-to-face. Whether that has any rationality behind it or not, but I just thought I'd put it in there. And then we've got all the other things that have been going on. So levelling up, you have a new minister for levelling up. And the role that the civic universities are going to be required to play in order to support their local communities, particularly in disadvantaged areas. There's been a lot around culture wars, wokery, freedom of speech, and so on. The Higher Education Act is going to be reviewed, in theory, in the coming Parliament. That's the 2015 Act, so it's up for review, and freedom of speech will feature as one of the key areas. And I just thought I'd put this quote in from the new CEO of the Office for Students, who is not a fan of Athena Swan and the Race Equality Charter, and fired some quite hefty broadsides at Advanced HE with regard to those in terms of the free speech duty and the belief, I think, derived potentially from a Daily Mail article that they always have very accurate sources, that Athena Swan and the REC were a real challenge to true freedom of speech. Student access and success, I'll be picking up on that. Boots on the ground, yep, going to pick up on that as well. Ref, you had your ref results. Everybody sort of moved up a bit, but the sector as a whole didn't change very much, but there will be a little bit more funding. TEF was deferred a little bit. So I'm going to be talking quite a bit about TEF. So that's going to be in the spring. The sector as a whole responded to OFS to plead in the consultation that TEF should be put back. It was supposed to be November, your submission time. But also, as we know, OFS have been really struggling with getting TEF together. And what I'm going to be talking about is still not finalized. So OFS has still not set out the final sets of criteria for TEF. QAA demits as DQB, the designated quality body. I'll talk about that as well, because that could be quite significant for the sector. The B conditions, your favorite conditions. You all know your A, B, and C conditions from the OFS. I'm sure they're all inscribed on your souls. So those have been significantly revised and strengthened, and I'll talk about those. And then we've got back to exams for A-levels, etc. More 18-year-olds, there's more students around. And of course, UCU ballots and strike actions. So there is a new UCU ballot gone out yesterday. The only little touch of irony that I find in that is that UCU themselves are struggling to manage things because their own Unite staff are on strike over pay and conditions. Hey, it could only happen in higher education, couldn't it? So I just wanted to touch on, this is data you probably know already, but just to remind you of what's going on within the sector. So as you can see, the number of 18-year-olds admitted, and this is obviously, it will have risen slightly since then, is at its highest level ever, partly because of the increase in numbers, but also the way the sector has responded. So we've got more 18-year-olds in higher education than we've ever had before. But if you look at all the other areas, mature students are at the lowest level ever. So we now have fewer mature entrants to higher education than we've ever had. Now, you might argue that's partly because as the proportion of 18-year-olds has gone up, there have been fewer mature students requiring higher education or looking for higher education. So there is a small bit of that, but it's also the challenges around funding, support, and so on that the mature students see. The gap between males and females is increasing. So year on year, we have a higher proportion, an increasingly higher proportion of females versus males going into higher education. And that's across all age groups, but particularly noticeable in the 18-year-olds. The other two areas that I thought were interesting, there's loads of data on the UCAS site that you can trawl through. IMD, that's the Index of Multiple Deprivation. So that replaces POLAR as a slightly more accurate measure. What's interesting here, 2 points to just draw out. Quintile 1, so those are the most disadvantaged, they're gradually creeping up. But the overall gap between the most advantaged, quintile 5, and the disadvantaged areas has pretty much remained the same for a long time. So all the work around access and participation and so on is not closing that gap significantly. And then this final graph that I just want to show you about the tariff group providers, which again is really interesting. So as we all know, quite a few of the high tariff universities massively over recruited last year. And you can see that this year, in general, they've reined back very significantly. And you've seen a comparable feed through to the lower tariff and medium tariff institutions. So those are, so in particular, the medium tariff institutions are back to where they were sort of round about 2017. So they had that big dip and they've pulled back up so that the sector's there. And of course, again, that's the reduction in higher tariff admissions has raised whole loads of questions about 3A star students not getting their first choice and so on. But it was fairly inevitable given what's happened and given the backflow of people who deferred from last year. So those are the students you're getting. There's more debate about the accuracy of A levels. There's a piece by Dennis Sherwood in media, in the HEPI reports about the extent to which A levels are not an accurate reflection of student performance and grading accuracy. And he's saying sort of 1 in 15 students shouldn't be at the university they're at the moment. But that's where we are. Okay, so our new friends, the Office for Students. So we have a new lead on access and participation, John Blake, who has come from the school sector, who was appointed in January 2022. He's taken over from Chris Millward, who's been snaffled by Birmingham. So his sector priorities, in particular, to increase the interactions between schools and universities. And this is what he's been talking about all the time since January. The universities must do much, much more to interact with schools and, as he put it, remove what he refers to as the hidden hierarchies of that relationship. Also, there's a focus not just on widening access, but ensuring success. And this comes through again in the OFS conditions for registration. But one of the follow-throughs from that is that universities have been invited to rewrite their access and participation plans to show how they're going to support the success and progression of widening participation students more effectively. So most of your universities will be working on those or will have already done that. And of course, we've got the departure of Nicola Dandridge as CEO, and Deputy Susan Lapworth has been appointed. Revised conditions for registration I will talk about. And we've got the revision to the NSS. That's the latest consultation out in 2023. So the plan is that for July 2023, there will be a new NSS. One of the things that almost certainly will go is the famous question 27. You all know your NSS, don't you? 27 is the overall satisfaction question. So that, interestingly, is going to be removed. OFS have already pretty much headlined that. What else is going to change? I don't know, but it will make, again, obviously it will change all the league tables and so on. So you won't have the sequential balancing of league tables. Value for money, of course, is still there, very, very much to the fore. So what does Susan Lapworth say about it? Still too many pockets of poor provision that don't give students a great deal or a good deal. And they're really cracking down on that. So next month, 3rd of October, the new B conditions come into force. They include absolute thresholds for continuation and progression. So there will be a specific number of your students must, in every program, must continue and must access graduate level employment. The analysis shows that whilst the majority of the sector overall is fine, almost every university in the country will have at least 1 or 2 courses that don't meet those criteria. So you would need to look at those. Then related to that is the boots on the ground statement and specific investigations and into the regulation of quality within the higher education. So it's going to be managed by the OFS. And they have appointed a cohort of quality assessors, and they're just appointing the lead assessors now. So these are people who will go out and visit your university if OFS has reason to be concerned about the quality and standards of the programs you're delivering. The capacity to do that is going to be fairly limited. So again, most of the sector will be safe, but it's worth just being mindful of that. And of course, grade inflation is still up there very much. The sector, clearly because of the way finals were marked last time, had a massive uplift in first class degrees last year. And the OFS has signaled again its determination to crack down on unexplained increases in degree classifications. And if you go on their website, for every higher education provider, you can see the proportion of first and 2-1s that have been awarded and what OFS calculates as the unexplained proportion of first and 2-1s for that provider. And they have signaled that they have initiated the first tranche of that. So 3 providers who will remain unnamed are being investigated in the initial trial of this. But there will be more down the line because Susan Lapworth is absolutely adamant that standards must be maintained. new TEF framework that's going to come in. So what's happening with TEF? As you know, it's going to remain at provider level, but the reviewers will have access to subject level data. So although the judgment will be at provider level, you won't have to write subject level submissions, which, if you remember, was the pilot a few years ago. They will be able to see if there are any disciplines that are particularly out of line. It's going to be a 4-year cycle, so it's going to be like REF. So all institutions who are on the OFS register will be reviewed at once. And that also means that, unlike last time, when we had the first cycles of TEF, it was an annual process, and if you didn't like your result, you could go in again next year. You could resubmit your essay for marking again. That's not going to happen. Your grade will remain for 4 years. And we've retained gold, silver, and bronze. Hooray. But there's also requires improvement. And that will attract a quality and standards review. Now, that would have been undertaken by QAA, but of course, QAA is no longer a designated quality body, so it might well be undertaken by OFS itself. The philosophy has changed. In the previous rounds, there was an assumption of excellence. So the starting point, when I was on the TEF panel, the starting point was that all institutions theoretically were excellent and at a silver level, and they either went up or down from that. Now there is no initial hypothesis, so everybody is starting from the same baseline and you're building up. There is a separate student submission. So I'm sure your student unions are working on that at the moment. But again, that will be very interesting to see how that plays in. Your institutional submissions will be really important. OFS have promised that not more than half of the value of the judgment will be metric driven. So at least half of it will be based on your qualitative institutional submission. But, and there's a big but, it needs to be verifiable. In the previous round, as assessors, you took on trust what institutions said about themselves in their submission. This time, the OFS reserve the right to go back to any institution and say, show us the evidence for what you've written in paragraphs 27 to 54 about how you're supporting students or whatever. And you'll have to be able to produce that documentation straight away as part of the judgment process. And educational gain will be in there. Many of you will probably remember in the days of HEFKI, there was a huge project with several millions of pounds put into it to enable the sector to define educational gain. And the last workshop I chaired for HEFKI of what became OFS was the final presentations where everybody agreed we couldn't do it. So now what's happening is part of your submission, and a very significant part of your submission will be how your institution is defining educational gain and how it's supporting your students to attain that. And you will be judged on both those areas, whether OFS thinks, or the TEF panel thinks, that your interpretation of what educational gain is valid and justifiable, and whether you can provide the evidence as to how you meet it. And it can't be prospective. It can't be, oh, we're going to do this, this, and this in 5 years' time. It's got to be what you're doing now and how you're building forward. So that's going to be a really important part of your submission. And of course, there will be the metrics. So 4 years of data. You'll get a workbook as before. You'll be benchmarked as before, but it's going to include geographies in employment. That's the one positive that I see in all of this. Previously, where your institution was located did not impact on your data for graduate progression, graduate salaries, and so on. Now they're going to incorporate that. So if you are in an area of deprivation and your students remain in that area, you will have a different benchmark to those who are at Imperial in London or whatever. So that will help in terms of interpreting that data. NSS will be there teaching, assessment, support, learning resources, and student voice. And the B3, continuation, so that's progression from first year of higher education to second year of higher education. Completion, and this is one of the areas that has not been finalized yet, because how do you interpret completion? There's two ways of doing it. There's the HESA data, which is slightly prospective, but allows you to look at it in cohort. So HESA produces data working out what percentage of each institution's students will complete. Or there's actual completion data. In other words, how many students from your 2018 cohort actually graduated. And that is really quite difficult to get because, of course, students have different timelines. Some of them might go part-time, some of them might take a year out, some of them might do an intercalated year, and so on. So pulling that data together is difficult, and that's not been finalized, how that will be done. And, of course, success, progression to employment, and that's graduate level employment or further training. And degree outcomes. So your grade inflation figures will be there. The profile of your entrance will be there, and access. And of course, when you're looking at your data, it's really quite complicated. I found when I was writing our previous submission before, getting academics' heads around the fact that you're not dealing with a single cohort, because all of these are reflecting different cohorts of students. They're overlapping, but they're all different cohorts. And so when you're writing your submission, you need to be really mindful of what cohort you're talking about. So when you're talking about NSS versus your continuation, you're talking about different spreads of students and things like that. So that's what the framework's going to look like. There'll be two criteria, two aspects: student experience and student outcomes. And you can see up there what's in there, what's in each of those. So the evidence set will be your submission, the student submission, and in one case the NSF, and in one case the outcomes indicators. So that's what you're going to be graded against. And you'll get your gold, silver, or bronze, or required improvement based on that. Again, there is a draft document on the OFS website that you can look at with a lot more detail input. It's not been finalized yet. I thought it was worth just mentioning QAA. Love them or hate them, they've been around for a very long time now, over 20 years. I first engaged with them back in 2000, so that's scary. So they stopped being the designated quality body. The reason being that QAA are part of ENQA, which is the European Quality Assurance Agency grouping. And ENQA told them that they could no longer be part of ENQA if they remained part of the English higher education system. And that's because of these three reasons, because the English programs no longer adhere to what Europe expects. So you no longer have the periodic external QA reviews. So those are gone. I know lots of institutions are very happy about that. You don't have, in England, this all refers to England, Scotland and so on are different, and I'll touch on that. So your 5 or 6 yearly visit from QAA has been stopped. Bizarrely, one of the real stumbling blocks was because OFS doesn't have students on all its review panels. So it's the office for, yeah. And we all thought that student representation on panels was something that everybody had to be doing everywhere. And I thought, anyway. And the OFS refuses to publish all its review reports. So because QAA gets most of its business now from outside England, mainly internationally, it was not worth it for QAA to remain as part of the English system. So it has rejoined ENQA and has stopped being the DQB for England. And of course, in theory, that means that degrees awarded by English universities don't have to be recognized within Europe. So if you say you've got a Bachelor of Science from Cardiff and you go to Tübingen, they say, what's this place? It's not an accredited institution. I'm sure that won't happen, but that's the theory that is there. The more scary bit is there has to be a new DQB. OFS can take it on themselves. They're allowed to. They were not supposed to, because it's supposed to be a separate, independent, arm's length body. But they could take it on. They could pass it to Ofsted. That'd be fun. Or get another body to do it. But there has to be a DQB, and they've got to move on that quite fast. So watch this space. And then just whatever happened to, so that's still going on. Interestingly, I don't know if those of you who are sad enough to follow USS valuations, because of the interesting way in which USS manages its finances and its investments, and certain organizations as a result of the energy crash performed extraordinarily well, USS has gone from a big deficit to being in surplus. I will say no more about that. Auga, it's still there. It's still there. The spending review just keeps getting put back. But what we do know is there won't be an increase in fees. Learning gain, but it appears in tests, that's still there. Student number controls and MERS. So the Treasury is still wanting to put in place student number controls. And there's still the talk about minimum entry requirements for higher education. That's still there. It's still in the background. It hasn't gone away. CMA is still there, and there have been class actions around delivery during COVID. BTECs, are they going? Or are they going to be saved? Who knows? And I just thought it'd be worth reflecting. This is what the asterisk ones are what I wrote 2 years ago. But potentially they still hold true. So financially, it's going to be a really tough year for the sector, again, because the fee income is decreasing. It's well down on what it was initially. Plans for the new TEF and low-value courses, so that's come true. Huge differences in the levels of education, that's still there, very much so, and we haven't reduced the access gap. How are A-levels managed? What's going to happen in 2023? Are we going to go back to 2019 levels, or are we going to have a soft landing? We're somewhere between 2022 and 2019 as we've decreased. What's going to happen there? We'll move to PQA. Our new Prime Minister did mention it again as part when she was talking in some of the hustings. So that comes and goes like a sort of bad smell. Revision of the NSS, still there. And of course, we've got the cost of living crisis coming down the track, which is, again, going to influence the sector really massively. We've also been promised, again, a bonfire of quangos. And Ms. Truss did mention in, again, one of her early speeches that the OFS might be one of the targets. Thank you.
We've got time for quick questions from the room. Anyone? Maybe put anything on Padlet. So, anyone have a question for John?
Sarah.
Just about if there's no change in fees, there was some usage change in foundation fees. That when you say they don't expect to change in fees, will that also cover foundation?
Sorry, yeah, no, I was talking about the standard student loan book fee, yeah, the 9250, yeah.
So is that still on the cards with foundation for if there may be change?
There may be, it's not been decided.
So still up in the air.
Still up, yeah. Nick.
So that thing about baseline, progression, and completion.
Yeah.
So if they give us a baseline, we'll meet it, can't we? So we'll just dumb down our assessments to make sure everybody passes. So that surely is not what the government wants. But that's what we'll do as rational. We repeat. If they set us a target, we'll meet it.
I couldn't possibly comment.
What's different? Thank you very much, John.
Thanks.